Dr. Marjorie Schleper. Marjorie was born and raised in central Minnesota and graduated from the University of Minnesota College of Veterinary Medicine in 2019. Following graduation, she began working as a staff veterinarian for Christensen Farms, based in Sleepy Eye, Minnesota. And I can see here in your slide, Marjorie, that you guys are celebrating 50 years as well, just like the Leman Conference. So great. Thank you for being here with us today and talking about this.
Well, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. All right. So I'm here today to talk about alternatives to rendering for nursery girl finish, mortality management, a cost and feasibility analysis. But I'm going to start right now with a disclaimer. You're not going to see dollars and cents in this presentation. Every location across the US, every specific dimension and specification that you choose to use within these methods of mortality management could drastically change your costs. So sorry, but that's the research you guys are going to have to do. I'm going to talk a little bit about it more from a holistic approach possibly here. And so I'm going to share how we, as Christensen Farms, how we grappled with the mortality management problem, right? And so a lot of the decisions we make, they go through our 4 Ps. So we're looking at sustainability not as that fluffy kind of curse word that it sometimes becomes within the agricultural industry, you know. We're looking at sustainability as a lot more tangible. We want to be in this industry forever. And if that's our goal, we need to make sure we're taking care of our people, our pigs, our planet, and we got to be financially sustainable as well. So that's where the prosperity comes into. So you'll see this theme throughout the presentation today. And when you're talking about mortality management goals, or mortality management in general, you got to know what your goal is, right? And of course, the top one, I think we're all would be aligned with that. The first goal is minimize the mortality that you have. It's a lot less risky if you just don't have it in the first place. But as I've heard it said before, if you're raising livestock, you're gonna have some dead stock. So how are you gonna manage with that? Again, people. We need whatever process we're gonna choose to be safe for our people. We want them to go home in the same or better condition than when they came to work here. And then with that, it's never fun to manage dead stock, but there's definitely a difference in scale on what that mortality management looks like as far as employee satisfaction or the employee experience around managing mortality. And then our pigs. We gotta minimize the biosecurity risk. I just heard a great presentation about some of the challenges with rendering specifically, but I charge you that any of them could be a problem if you're not getting the pigs out of the barn biosecurely in the first place. And then regulatory compliance, right, the planet side of it. And that is not one we're gonna dive deep into today because it is so variable state by state and where you're at. And so again, sorry, that one's the research you guys are gonna have to do. And then there's both the health and the environmental component within that. And then public relations, and I heard it said earlier about, you know, ASF, foreign animal disease, different mortality management solutions can set you up for an easier time in an outbreak or maybe a bigger adjustment should an outbreak happen. So if these are our overall goals, what does actual success look like? And so for that, for us, it's pathogen destruction. Part of biosecurity is if we can just destroy the pathogen in the first place, then we don't have to worry about it. We have to have a solution that we can actually manage. And labor's always a premium, right? It's always hard to find good, I heard it earlier, motivated individuals. So a solution that will work with the people as well. And then optimal temperature, obviously a little bit more specific to incineration and composting, but depending on where you're at in the US and what your average temperatures are, you might have to take that into account with rendering as well. Bone, or I should say probably carcass decomposition, end product, what does that look like? Odor, both for our own employees, but also neighbor relations. And then vectors, pests, rodents, birds, that stuff. We don't want to draw more of those into our sites. Environmental compliance, and of course, again, prosperity. It's got to be an acceptable cost so that we can be long-term in this business. One more disclaimer. It's gonna look different for every company, every producer, because again, there's so many different ways to do it. But a few things to really, really look in deep if you're considering changing what you're gonna do around mortality management is you gotta do a deep dive on what your mortality looks like. Not just the overall numbers, but also when is that mortality happening? And I know that's a hard analysis to do because each turn can be different, but whether you're losing little wean pigs or you're losing a lot of market pigs could change which mortality method you want to use. The water content in those animals, as well as just the overall pounds of pork that need to be managed, can change your decision there. And then what are you going to do with that byproduct or that end product? Do you have your own ground that you can spread compost on that you don't really care what the end product looks like, or do you got to manage farmer relationships? And one thing I actually learned in coming up with this presentation was I was always confused why our agronomy department was always so focused on bones. Bones, bones, bones. We can't compost because of bones. Who cares about the bones? Well, the farmer that has their farm implement tire punctured because of a rib bone in the field, that destroys your farmer relationships real fast. So it is something to consider. And then also just, do you have the ground, the physical ground space to put, say, a compost bays or windrows on? And then with that, there's a little bit of a risk tolerance piece, again, around a lot of the times the end product or that waiting time before that mortality's gone. There are 50,000 million ways, I think, on how you can manage your mortality. This is just a quick list of some of them. Within composting alone, there's so many different styles and systems. And then it gets even to be a longer list considering that you can mix and match them. You can incinerate some, compost some, or vice versa. And so for the purposes of today, I had to simplify it. And so from this list, I went to these three. So for the rest of today, when I'm talking about rendering or incineration or composting, this is what I'm talking about. The 4 Ps again. So people considerations, right? So labor and time requirement. And when I thought about labor and time, I thought first about what is that experience for that employee that has to remove that pig from the site? How much time is that going to take them, and how easy it is to do? And so for rendering, I said it's going to be a low labor impact, right? I get the mortality out of the barn, in the box, done for the day. Well, there's a little bit of an extra layer on that. If your employees are about my size, and you have a late finishing break with a bunch of 280-pound hogs on a 95-degree day, and I've got no equipment to move that mortality out, that suddenly becomes a lot longer, more labor involved process. So consideration there. And then it's quick though. I mean, depending on what your rendering pickup schedule is, that mortality's gone in a couple of days, right? Incineration, I said this one's a little bit more of a medium labor component because you gotta know a little bit more about how that incinerator runs. You gotta clean that incinerator out before you can start the next cycle. And you might have to do a little bit of troubleshooting. And then there's also a little bit of a maintenance component as well. You might not be able to get your mortalities incinerated for the day if your incinerator is not working. But by and large, as long as everything's working, it's a pretty quick process. Again, mortality out of the barn, in the incinerator, by tomorrow morning it's gone. Composting, on the other hand, I'd say would be a much larger labor intense process, right? The initial every day, just getting them out of the barn and into the bays, maybe not that big of a deal, but you gotta record temperatures, you gotta turn compost piles. Are you gonna screen later and get the bones out of that compost? Where is your carbon source located? Do you gotta drive down the road to go get it, or is it right there? There's a lot more variables that go into composting and composting correctly. And then it's slow process. You saw it in some earlier presentations here. I mean, it can take easily up to a year before that whole process is done and that pig is gone. Technical skill, that went beyond a little bit the true man hours. It's more of how hard is this gonna be to train my employee to do this right every day? And then as well as what do we need from a maintenance proponent or perspective? Really, for rendering, it's pretty easy to train, except, as Dr. Pawlowski just did a nice job talking about, there's still those SOPs about getting that mortality out of the barn. Those tend to be the most, and then cleanly into the box and back into the barn, or back into the barn the next day. Those can still be some blurry lines, and they might need a little bit more training than what we often give them credit for. And then depending on what equipment you do supply for those employees, you know, a skid steer or a motorized dead cart, you might need some extra training on how to appropriately use that equipment for the lifetime of that equipment, to extend the lifetime of that equipment. But really minimal M&R maintenance requirements. Incineration, on the other hand, though, that's pretty high. It's a lot more of a technical process. Again, there's a safety risk there, so you want to make sure you train that really well. And then you would want employees to be able to do some basic troubleshooting, so that if there isn't something working great with the push of the button, they can kind of figure out what needs to happen, and hopefully not have to call your maintenance person. However, and especially with these specific incinerators, which we do have a few in our system, we did find that those afterburners that are part of that whole system, they tend to be a little bit higher maintenance than what is maybe generally thought of. And so there will be some maintenance or M&R support needed to run that version of incineration. But I would say that's probably across the board on pretty much any of the incinerators. And then composting, medium high. Again, I think it's important that employees understand the overall process of composting, so that they can identify problems early and get it fixed before you have an absolute mess on your hands. Because composting done poorly is kind of ugly. But again, very, very minimal M&R maintenance support needed. And then this ability to recover from issues. I took that in two ways. One is you have a massive mortality spike that you didn't design your system to handle, or a part of your system, your mortality management equipment itself, broke down. And so the ability to recover if you've got a large mortality spike, for instance, in rendering, should be pretty high. It should be pretty easy. Should be able to call up your renderer, request some more pickups, or we've had some success even when we've had a lot of mortality to be able to get some of those roll-off type containers that were talked about earlier. Now, that will be dependent on your relationship with your rendering provider, but should be pretty easy. Versus incineration, ooh, that one's gonna be a problem. If you've got a bunch more mortality than what you expected, or your incinerator's down for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 days, now what you gonna do with that? You either gotta camp someone out there by that incinerator to just kind of keep on filling, or you're gonna get pushed to use one of the alternative methods, which is probably gonna be rendering. I mean, you could compost. You could set up some windrows and you could do some composting, but that's gonna require a lot more training and a lot more decision making than, say, just calling the rendering truck. And then composting, it's along the same lines with incineration. You're probably not gonna have a mechanical breakdown, but again, you have that large mortality spike. Do you have enough carbon source on hand? Do you have enough room in your bays to handle that? And so again, you may end up choosing to grab rendering for a short-term bridge the gap solution. The pig, the second P. And of course, the first one you got to think about when you think about the pig is biosecurity, right? And we've heard a lot about the challenges and risks around biosecurity to rendering, so I won't hammer on that one. Incineration, low to medium. Really, the only time it's probably gonna come to a medium risk is dependent on how you're gonna get that fuel source to your incinerator. If it's connected to a bunch of other sites because they're making a route to drop off that fuel, it's probably not as biosecure as what you initially think of when you think incineration. And kind of the same for composting. It could be really, really low risk if you're an independent producer and you've got your corn stalks or your straw or whatever you want to use. You've been clearing out a bunch of trees and you got a bunch of chipped wood that you want to use with your composting. Super low biosecurity concern. Well, you got to go to the auction and go buy some. Might be a little bit of a higher risk there. Pathogen destruction, clearly none within rendering, at least on farm. Of course, once it leaves the farm and goes, yep, there would be some. But as far as your farm itself is concerned, there's no destruction. And then with incineration, it's complete as long as it's all working well. And then composting would be variable. It really depends on how effective is your compost program. If you don't hit your temperatures, you're not going to destroy the pathogens. And then your scavenger risk or pest risk. Rendering, medium to high. I mean, maybe if you've got the best managed rendering box in the area and the other rendering boxes in your community are easier target for the coyotes and the other pests that were mentioned earlier, maybe you've got a low risk, but you're likely to attract some more of those to that area. You can minimize some of that with how fast are you having pickup being done. The longer you have carcasses out there, the more attraction that's going to be. And then incineration, it should be really low. Really, your only risk point is how long does it take you from once that mortality is outside of the barn to when is it actually in the incinerator. I will tell you from experience, if you move mortality out in the morning and they don't get incinerated till the afternoon, and that is a regular occurrence, the scavengers in the area will learn the routine and they'll be there waiting for them. So yeah, take that into consideration with your SOPs that were talked about earlier. And then composting, medium to high, again, a lot of it comes down to management. If you're getting that composting going really fast, getting to that hot temperatures and carcasses are being broken down pretty quickly, it's a lower risk, but you still got them out there sitting there for some period of time. The third P, the planet. Environmental compliance, again, I said I'm not going to dive deep into this. Just know that there are so many different rules and regulations around leachate or particle emissions for each state, sometimes even within counties. And so you really got to do your homework as to what permitting is required or anything like that. But in general, rendering's pretty low risk. You just got to contain those fluids that were talked about earlier. Incineration, yeah, you may have to do emissions testing. You may have to track temperatures and other, how is this equipment working to satisfy state requirements. And then composting, you got that leachate. You have a product that maybe doesn't get completely composted. There's some risk there as well. And odor within the planet considerations, I think we'd all agree that in Minnesota on a 95-degree day, no one wants to go out to the mortality box to go cut up the dead that was just put in there an hour ago. It already stinks pretty bad. And then what does that mean for your neighbor relations, right? We're trying to provide a good image to the public about pig farming, and is that the image we want to portray out there? Incineration, there's definitely an odor to incineration. Incineration done well, I don't think is necessarily a unpleasant odor, but there's one there. And if you're not used to smelling that, it will catch your attention. So again, consider that for neighbors. And then if you do have some issues with that equipment and it's not burning the way it was designed to burn, that's when you can get some pretty nasty smelling odor coming out of an incinerator. So equipment maintenance and upkeep is really, really important with incineration. In composting, again, how good are you? If you got a really good composting going, that odor is going to be a lot lower. If it's kind of a slow, more of a decaying process, that odor is going to be higher. And then within that kind of sustainability picture, right, and we talked about it earlier with rendering as well, at least with the rendering, there's a future use for that product, right? We're turning that pig into a usable product. Incineration, you really don't have anything. It's ash, pretty low value byproduct there. And then composting, I'm sorry, but I keep coming back to how good are you? How good of a product are you turning out with that compost product? Are you gonna screen the bones or not screen the bones? Are you gonna do some extra additional recompost? That all will dictate the value of that final product. And now the fourth P, prosperity, or the cost. And again, I warned you, there's no dollars and cents on here. But in general, rendering, it's gonna be your least cost option. It is super cheap to put a mortality box somewhere on the property. Really very little operating cost. If you're gonna, provide your staff or your team with a skid loader or something like that, there might be a little bit of upkeep and maintenance on that equipment, but really, it's gonna be your lowest cost option. Incineration, it's gonna be high. that capital cost to go get that incinerator, even if you're not getting the top of the line incinerator, that's a big deal. And then the ongoing fuel cost, which fuel are you gonna purchase? What kind of deals can you make to get that fuel? And then there is going to be that maintenance cost. Don't forget to figure that in when you're running your numbers. And then composting, I said it earlier, do you have your own carbon on site already? Or do you have to go purchase that? Because that's gonna be one of your biggest variables on how expensive composting is for you. And then even that initial build. You can build the Taj Mahal of static bays, or you can build the get you by starter home version. So decide what you want for lifetime performance there. Whenever you're thinking about mortality, you gotta go back to the beginning of that presentation and what are your goals? What are the characteristics that matter to you as an independent producer, as a system? And then, and I've said it time and time again, don't forget, or don't just look at the sticker tag to install the system. You gotta look at the lifetime operational cost. And the only way to do that really is to really do a good analysis of what you expect mortality to be on that site. And again, the benefits only exist if you can actually get that mortality out of the barn safely in the first place. If you've got birds flying over, dropping PED in front of your barn, and you don't have good clean lines getting that mortality out, it doesn't matter if you incinerate. And then those benefits, those biosecurity benefits only exist if it's done correctly, and I would say that's especially with composting. So even if we all agree today that rendering is the most risky biosecure thing we could do, we want to go away from rendering, we're all going to commit that we're going to all go to composting or incineration. That's not going to happen tomorrow. So considering that rendering is probably the most common process out there today, how can we make rendering less risky for our pigs in our barn? So for me, I think it comes down a lot to the right equipment. I said it earlier, if your employees are my size, don't expect us to wrestle a bunch of 280-pound market hogs out into a box without stepping into that box, without stepping across clean, dirty lines. We'll do our best, just physically can't do it, right? So get the right equipment. There's a ton of options out there. We talked about Hercules, that's becoming a more common thing on a sow farm. Action trackers, maybe those aren't the right option for nursery grow finish, but there's other smaller equipment that's out there that can work really well. Even just sleds or carts can be really helpful too. Skid loaders, the Taj Mahal, the version, if you've got a skid loader, you don't ever have to step in that mortality box. You can just dump them in and drive away. And then at the minimum, you gotta provide inside and outside equipment, tools, and boots. You don't want that same clothing, boots, tools that went over to the rendering box where we just demonstrated that you can find virus coming right back into the barn today or tomorrow. And with that, already was talked a lot about what's the best setup you can do. Ideally, you have that rendering box on a separate driveway. Ideally, you have physical barriers between where the rendering truck's gonna pick up and where your farm staff is expected to drop that mortality off. Ideally, you'd set up a system to where your employees don't have to actually step and dance around in that mortality box to get everything inside. So do you build a ramp up one side so they can just drop the mortality in? Pretty cheap. I mean, pile up some dirt. Not too hard to do. And then this is one I wrestle with a lot internally myself. To disinfect or not to disinfect a box. I still live by the phrase of you can't disinfect a turd. So not sure how much benefit there is to actually disinfecting the box itself, but is there some benefit to maybe around the box? And I come back to, I don't want my team stepping inside that box where the highest contamination is gonna be. And so if disinfecting means that they're gonna be inside that box, I don't want it. So decide what that looks like for you. And training. Dr. Pawlowski had a great comment around clear SOPs, tailored SOPs. And then do the training to get it done right, and then audit it. Final thing here, so the glow germ, it's a wonderful tool. Most people are visual learners. Use it. So we spread glow germ on our mortality box within our system. And I know it's going to be hard to see for the people in the back, but over there on the left-hand side, those circled areas are actually foot tracks. So you could track the footsteps back from that mortality box. And then the other 3 pictures are actually taken inside the office to that barn. So the top middle one there, that glow germ actually got through their cut-resistant gloves that we have our staff wear and was on their hands inside, back inside that farm office. That's kind of scary. And then the bottom middle picture, that's some glow germ on their coveralls that they had brought back into that office. And then boots as well. So again, the importance of outside clothing, or at least a good clean dirty line on where that outside clothing is going to live versus the inside clothing. So there's a lot we can do today to make rendering less risky as we consider some of the other processes for mortality management that we know carry a lower biosecurity risk. So with that, any questions?
Thank you, Dr. Schleper. We already have one question over here.
Thanks so much. Great presentation, this one and the previous one as well. And this addresses some of the comments that both of you have made. And I just want to offer that one of the things that one of the layer companies has invested in is dedicated outside people and inside people. And it might help with compliance, and it's an investment for sure, but it helps with compliance, and I think it has actually saved them for the last 7 years because they underwent the outbreak in 2015, and it's a really good investment, I think, and might help with some of this. So.
Yeah, that's a great comment. I think a lot of focus needs to be done on how people move throughout that day. Whether you're talking sow farm or nursery finish, people movement, they're the ones interacting with your pigs. So what else do they interact with? Great comment.
Thank you. Thank you.